Red Flags series. I want to share something with you that I've read about. Night after night, there was this lady, and she shared how she found herself trapped in a cycle. And she would call it a cruel cycle. Night after night, as the house where she lived fell silent, her grief that she felt would not let her rest. Instead, every night she was plunged into a world of very vivid dreams where her husband and her 2 sons were still alive. Their laughter would fill the empty spaces of her house all around her. And these dreams that she would have were so real and so tangible that waking from them felt like she was losing them all over again. And the shock of their absence, when she would wake up and realize, it would send her heart racing, leaving her gasping in the dark, a victim of panic that clawed at her chest. And it had been about a decade ago that her husband had passed away, and leaving just her and her 2 sons. And she felt like fate, it seemed cruel, and within months of each other, both sons passed away, leaving her not only alone, but now facing new hardships, financial hardships that seemed to multiply each day. The bills, the costs of funerals, they had drained what little money she had, and now every unexpected expense felt like a new mountain to climb up. But she would say that the nights felt they were the hardest. She would try to sleep, but she would be jolted awake by panic attacks, her breath short, her body trembling. The fear wasn't just about the bills or the empty house that she was in. It was the fear of facing every new day without the family that she had known and built her life around. During the day, she tried to distract herself with odd jobs that she could find around town. She would garden for a neighbor. She would babysit for another. Really, each job just reminded her of her own family, how each child's laugh was a bittersweet echo of her own son's childhoods. Of course, these jobs, they weren't enough financially really to keep her going, to steady her financial woes. And oftentimes she found herself choosing between eating or warming her home. As every evening would begin to draw near, dread would settle in her stomach. She knew what awaited her in the solitude of her bedroom. It was a house, a room that was too big, filled with memories that felt too painful. And the dreams that she would have would come, and it felt like both a curse and a comfort. Seeing her husbands, her sons again in her sleep, experiencing moments of happiness that felt so real, only highlighted the loneliness of her world when she would wake up. And her friends, the ones that would still reach out to her, they didn't fully understand. They would tell her, why can't you just move on from this? They saw her being withdrawn, and they saw her blank stares, and they saw when they would extend an invitation that she wouldn't answer. They saw those things as a refusal on her part to heal. But for her, the dreams, the nightmares were her reality now. Maybe the only time that she could see her family, hold them, even if she knew they would slip away when she'd wake up in the morning. With each passing day, the blend of dream and reality, it left her worn out and it left her caught in this weird limbo, in between space between past happiness and current despair. Again, her financial pressures, they loomed large, but nothing was more defeating than the nightly battle with her grief. As the sun would rise and marking the start of another long day, Naomi would try to face the world with a facade of resilience, while inside the turmoil of her dreams and fears, they continued to rage on and on. When I consider that story, we oftentimes think that the Bible is boring, right? The Bible, just like our lives, is very real. It's very intense, and it can be even troubling sometimes. Because you see, we're given glimpses into people's lives. We're given this view into their lives of the things that they go through, of very real people who went through some very real things that we go through in our own lives as well. It's one of the best things about the Bible because it becomes so relatable to us. And that's the whole red flags. That's what this whole series has been about. It's been things that are relatable, which means relationships, right? People we're connected with in life. A God who we're connected to and with in our lives. And guess what? Those relationships that we're in life, those relationships that we have, the people who we're connected with the God whom you're connected to and in relationship with, in those relationships, guess what? Bad things happen. We've all been there. We've all had those times when things didn't happen to us how we wish that they would have. Those things that we experience that have a major impact on us. Those things that we go through that if there was a way, if there was a different way, we wish there would have been. We would have chosen that. Those times, those situations that affect us deeply, it's trauma, right? And trauma, it's something that for some reason we often don't talk about in church. We struggle with it. We talk about situations and we talk about circumstances. But when I think back about how I've heard sermons like that, my own life, it seems like they were all centered around us overcoming situations and circumstances through God, which of course is true. The book of Romans tells us that through Christ we're much more than conquerors. So we know that's true, overcoming situations. But I also know that I've been in those sermons and I've sat through those kind of messages or discussions that are being had where it feels like what I'm being told I need to do to get over the things that have happened in my life have felt kind of hollow. It would leave me feeling like something was missing. And I think that's because churches and Christians, we gloss over others' trauma. We can even sometimes be guilty of dismissing it even when we don't validate what the other person is feeling, what they're going through, what they have been through, or when we struggle to stick with them as they're going through it, their trauma, as they're struggling with it, with what it does to them and what it brings into their lives. You see, there's a saying, and you've probably heard it if you've spent much time in church. Because what's interesting in church, one of the things that can happen in church is we develop our own language, right? We develop our own way of talking. And I wish that it was a heavenly language like Paul talks about in the New Testament. It's not that. We pick up what often gets referred to as Christianese. You ever heard of that term, Christianese? You know what that is? It's a language we use in our church culture when we start talking about, tell me if you've heard some of these words. We start talking about things like fellowship. And we start talking about things like hedges of protection or traveling mercies or being washed by the blood. All these things that we often know as Christians, as church people, and that's okay, there's not anything wrong with that. You see, I'm fluent in Christianese. I can speak it perfectly. But there is a problem when we say things that sound good, but we don't really mean that, right? And usually the biggest one that we say, but we struggle to mean is this one. Come as you are. Come as you are. Or we say, everyone's welcome. We take all kinds here. Those Christian phrases that we say, but it really comes down to it, we struggle to live out. Because I've been in those rooms. I've been in those Sunday school rooms in small groups when things get real. Those times when someone opens up. There's been times I've opened up. I mean, really opened up. And all the other people, when that person's done talking, sit there and they're like, wait, what? What in the world was that? What did they just say? Did you know that about them? We need to talk to the pastor about this, right? We got to see if he knows about this. We struggle when people truly open up. But church, we can't shy away from trauma that people have experienced. You see, trauma is defined as a deeply stressing or disturbing experience. Again, something that you go through in your life, something that you experience in your life that you never wanted to. You didn't want this to happen. It can be a lot of things. It can be something that happens in just a few moments. It can be something that goes on, is ongoing for a really, really long time. But here's the common denominator. No matter the situation, whether it happened in an instant or it took over years, here's the thing. You will carry it with you. When you go through something that's life-changing, when you go through something that is disturbing, that may have happened to you, an experience that you didn't want to have happen, you will carry it with you. You will carry it with you. We aren't immune from the effects of that, lasting effects that traumatic events cause in our lives. And there's a woman in the Bible who carried it with her. Her name was Naomi. And it was her story that I talked some about at the beginning. The story of her family as I imagine her dealing with grief. Because she had a family. She had a husband. She had 2 sons. Things, as far as we know, were going great in her family. Up until the very first verse in the Book of Ruth. Because in that first verse, we discover that for Naomi and her family in the land of Judah, there was a severe famine that hit hard. Which means that for Naomi and her family living in a small village called Bethlehem, does that sound familiar? Bethlehem, the same Bethlehem that Jesus was born in, a famine in a small village back then was a traumatic experience. So Naomi and her husband, they decide for their family, in their marriage, in their relationship, as parents, they'll have to leave to go and find food. Which is interesting. I want you to think about that. Put that in your pocket for a second, because we'll come back to their decision to leave. They decided to leave. They decided to travel about 50 miles or so to a different country, one that's called Moab. And in this country, it's made up of people there that are kind of like distant relatives to the Israelites. They have their lineage through Abraham's brother Lot. But those people don't serve God. Instead, they worship false gods. That's their culture. Last week, we talked a lot about culture. Naomi's family gets there with the intention to only be there for a little while. Only as long as the famine lasts. But what happens is they start to raise up their family there. These 2 sons, they grow up, and they grow up in that culture. Both the culture of a nation that doesn't serve God and a culture within their own family that struggles to fully trust God. Remember what we said last week. Culture can be defined as your worst tolerated behavior. Meaning this family had become a family that when asked, do you believe in God? They would have said yes. But when asked, do you trust God? They may have said yes, but their actions didn't match that. So this family, Naomi, her husband, her sons, they stay in Moab. And remember, they were just going to stay there for a little while. They end up staying there about 10 years. Which in my book isn't exactly the definition of a little while. I think 10 years, a little bit longer than that. And somewhere in those 10 years, but most likely early on, Naomi, her husband dies. Which leaves her then to finish raising her 2 sons. Naomi now has experienced 2 traumatic events. Famine and now becoming a widow. Some major life changes. And actually with even more on the way. Because Naomi's story continues. Her sons grow up, and probably at this time in their late teens, their early 20s, they each marry women. One son marries a woman named Orpah, and another one marries a woman named Ruth. Both of these women were from Moab, not Israel. Because remember, the culture in the family is that they believe in God, but they don't follow God's commands. You see, we have to be extremely careful of how we respond to those traumatic events in our lives when they happen. And what we have to be careful about, what we have to fight against when those things happen, when we go through trauma, what we have to fight against is the urge to dismiss God. And here's the thing, it almost always starts small. So the first time you get the urge to dismiss God is when he might ask something of you. It could be when he prompts you to volunteer at church. We always need more volunteers, right? But things have been tough lately. You got a busy schedule, so you can't do it right now. But that'll just be for a little while, right? Maybe when things slow down. What happens, though? Things don't ever slow down, right? Things don't ever get slower in life. They never do. We have to fight the urge to dismiss God. Because when we start giving into that urge, what happens is it becomes our automatic response. And that response will carry through every single area of your life. Because what will happen is you'll start to develop a habit and then a culture of just going ahead and dismissing God. Dismiss his ways, his commands, instead of learning his ways, loving his ways, living his ways, which is what we determined last week our lives have to be about as individual Christians, our marriages, our families. But Naomi and her family, they were not about those things. They knew God's commands, because back then, living in Israel, growing up there, they definitely would have known God's commands. They knew them. They didn't love them. They didn't live them out. Instead, they dismissed them in a time of famine when they left for a foreign country that didn't serve God. They dismissed them in marrying women from a foreign and pagan land. A culture had been created in this family, and it was a culture that did not trust God and his ways. And that culture would continue to be lived out in Naomi's life, especially in her response to those traumatic events. Because more traumatic events came her way, more loss. Both of her sons died. Lots and lots of tragedy in the life of Naomi. Traumatic events. And so Naomi, what was her response to all of this trauma? Well, she made a decision. She decided she needed to go back to Judah. Which seems like a good response, right? I'll go back to the land of God. But there's something in there we can't miss. Yes, she decided to go back to Judah, but that didn't equal her going back to God. Ruth 1:6 tells us that she heard that the famine in that country in Judah was over. So she, along with Ruth and Orpah, left to return to the land of Judah. And notice in that for Naomi, it's still all about food. Still all about what God will give her. Still all about what she thought God needed to give her instead of her relationship with God. And folks, we often do the same thing. When things get bad, that's when we usually come back to church, right? It's usually when we finally turn to God, we say, God, it's so bad right now, I don't know what else to do, and so I'll pray. I'll go back to church. Which, don't get me wrong, those are good things. That's what we need to do to go to God in our times of crisis. But what do our hearts desire in those times of crisis? It's for God to fix something, right? For him to change something, for him to make things better for us. Sounds good. It's very different from a desire for God to restore or strengthen your relationship with him. Because you see, what we say we need from God can't be in place of our need for a relationship with God. See, God needs us to move out of a place that tells him, God, just fix everything for me. Make it better. Change my situation. And instead, he needs us to allow him to move us to a place that now seeks God's wisdom, that seeks God's plans and his will and his purpose for our lives. Naomi, she wanted God to move her from one place that now had nothing left for her in this nation, this place called Moab, to a place that now this should fix all of my problems. See, her move to Moab, which was all about a need for food, only led her to burying her family in a foreign land and then going back to the place that she started in search of more food, not in search of a God who could save her and redeem her and restore her. So everything that Naomi went through, it all brought her to a place. And it's so much less. It's not really even about a physical place, but an emotional place. If you'll look with me at Ruth chapter 1, we're going to look at verses 19 through 21. Ruth chapter 1, 19 through 21. It says, the two of them, this is now Naomi and Ruth. Orpah did not end up going with them. The two of them traveled until they came to Bethlehem. When they entered Bethlehem, the whole town was excited about their arrival. The local women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara," she answered, "for the Almighty has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has opposed me and the Almighty has afflicted me?" So again, Naomi, along with her daughter-in-law Ruth, they leave the country of Moab. They walk the 50 miles or so, and what seems like silence, if you go back and read more of this story leading up to this, and they arrive in Bethlehem. And upon their arrival, we're told that there was excitement. Hey, new people have come to town. This is exciting in a small village back then. But as Naomi and Ruth walked into that small town, the village, the people there noticed something familiar about one of them. They looked at her, one of the women, and they thought, we might recognize her. And as they looked at her more intensely, they asked one another, "Can this be Naomi?" Those 10 or so years that she had been gone, we know from her story they had not been kind to her. The people were confused when they saw her. They were asking, "What happened to Naomi? Are you sure that's Naomi? That can't be. She doesn't look good. Where's the rest of Naomi's family?" And it's with this kind of voice that the question in verse 19, "Can this be Naomi?" is asked with. The aftermath of trauma is very evident in how Naomi looks, how she's carrying herself, the expression on her face. Things are clearly not well with Naomi. And her response, "Can this be Naomi?" Her response proves that. As she hears the whispers around her, she confirms, yes, this is Naomi. But things have changed. And so she snaps at them out of her anger and her grief and her trauma when she demands that these people who all know her now and recognize her as Naomi, she demands, "You no longer call me by that name." Instead, she says, "You call me Mara," which means bitter. In other words, she confirms that, yes, she's the one that left all of those years ago. Yes, she's the one that left full with a family, a husband. But now as she returns, she tells them, "I have come back empty." And not only is she not happy about it, but there's actually blame to be placed for her bitterness, at least in her eyes. And the blame only has one place to be placed, and that's squarely on the Lord. She says, "The Lord has brought me back empty. The Lord has opposed me. He has afflicted me." And as a result, she decides to go and change her name. No longer will she be known as Naomi, which means pleasant. She's determined that, no, things are no longer pleasant for me. Pleasant for Naomi was when she was full. Now there's only emptiness, and it is God's fault. But now what she's left with is bitterness. You see, we cannot change our names based on our circumstances. Our identities, who you are, cannot be based on your circumstances. Naomi's trauma, it affected her relationship with God. Trauma will actually always affect your relationship with God. It's just up to you how it will affect it. Don't let your trauma, what you've been through and what you're going through, don't let it change your name. Because remember, if you're a Christian, your name is child of God. Don't let the enemy trick you into changing it into anything else. Even in your trauma, even when times are rough. Because the reality of Naomi's story, it's a very familiar one. It's common for trauma to result and manifest itself in our lives with bitterness. It's the most natural way we allow trauma to change us. And here's how that happens. It's our expectations. When our expectations for our lives, what we thought would happen, what we wanted, don't happen. When what we want doesn't happen. When we lose what we want to keep. When something or someone close to us gets taken away. And in that moment, we cry out to God and we say, God, this wasn't supposed to happen this way. It wasn't supposed to be like this. This is not what I wanted. Why are you doing this to me? Which are those come as you are kind of words, right? Those are words that are real because we truly feel them. And those words, God, why? Why is this happening? I didn't want this. I didn't ask for this. I didn't sign up for this. Those words can be very hard to shake from our minds and from our hearts. Statements and questions that can be hard to let go of. Because we may not get the answers to those questions when we want them. We may not even get the answers to those questions on this side of heaven. And then in that moment, with those words beginning to take root, beginning to dig in and grow in your mind and in your heart, that's where you get a choice. You have a choice to make. And it's a question. Where will my dwelling place be? Where will I choose to dwell? Because you see, the word Mara, that Naomi changes her name to, it means bitter in the Hebrew language, but it was also a place. In fact, it's talked about in Exodus 15 when the Israelite people who God had just delivered them from the land of Egypt where they were slaves. He delivered them miraculously, and he brought them out, and they come up to the Red Sea, which looked absolutely impossible to get through. The Red Sea on this side, the Egyptian army over here, right on their tail, and God splits the Red Sea open. They walk through on dry land, and just as the Egyptian army is coming across, he causes it to come back down and delivers them completely from Egypt. Now they're on their way to the land that God has for them, this promised land that God has mentioned, that God has promised. They're on their way there, but they aren't there yet. They're at this in-between place. They aren't where they used to be, but they aren't in the place that God has promised for them yet either. And oftentimes that's where bitterness can really take root, when we're just in a place that we don't want to be at in-between time. Because again, these Israelites, they were promised a land that would be full of abundance. But they weren't there yet. Instead, in Exodus 15, they were at a place called Mara. And they were tired. And they were worn out. And they were exhausted. Tired, worn out, and exhausted. Do you know those words? We know those words, don't we? Maybe those words, tired, worn out, exhausted, ready to be done, ready to give up, frustrated, hopeless, angry, feeling defeated, feeling like I just get knocked down, and as soon as I get back up, I get knocked down again. The Israelite people were carrying those words with them as well. Yeah, they'd been delivered from Egypt, but they didn't know the first thing about living in any kind of freedom. All they knew were being slaves, and they were bitter. They knew bitterness. They were bitter about their situation, bitter about not having hope. They were bitter about everything. And yeah, God had delivered them, but then God takes them to a place in their moment of being tired, worn out, and thirsty. They come to a place called Mara. And the reason it was called that is because, yeah, it had water there, but that water wasn't any good to drink because it tasted bitter. And the Israelites, when they realized where they were at and they couldn't drink this water and they were tired and hot and thirsty, they throw up their hands and they say, now what are we going to do? They blame Moses, their leader. A place called Mara. We're not meant to dwell in a place called Mara. Because there's not anything for you there. There's only bitterness. But it's a decision. Because sometimes God brings us to a place and allows things to happen. And then he says, what will you do about it? Will you choose to trust me, or will you choose to dwell here and be bitter? It's up to you. What does all of this have to do with relationships? Well, I think we all have a relationship with trauma. Most of us struggle in that relationship. Denise, if you would come in our time of response, if you would stand with me. This word, Mara, again, it's referenced as being bitter. But it's based on ultimately expecting something, expecting one thing that is supposed to be good, like the water that they came to, but discovering that it's not, that it's bad, discovering that it's different. And just the Israelites, just like Naomi did, when the things that she wanted to be good in her life, now she felt like were bad, blamed God for their situation. God, though, he gave the Israelites a promise. When they realized that the water was bitter, they weren't sure what to do, God gave them a promise. Listen to this, out of Exodus 15. There the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and he tested them, saying, if you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God, do that which is right in his eyes, give ear to his commandments, keep all of his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord, your healer. Now listen to where he led them to. Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water, 70 palm trees, and there they encamped. There they encamped. There they decided to dwell for a little bit, to get restored, to let God be their healer. The Israelites, though, as good as that moment was for them, if you know their story, they never got over their bitterness. They never let God truly be the Lord of their lives. The only God that they worship, the only thing that they turned to. Instead, every time something went bad, they went back to those traumatic experiences and threw their hands up and said, now what are we going to do? It would have been better if we just died in Egypt. It would have been better if God had never delivered us. It would be better if we were still slaves there. They didn't know how to live in that freedom. We talked about it this morning in worship. There's freedom in Jesus. You're meant to live in that freedom. And there's freedom from things like bitterness. There's freedom from things that you've gone through and experienced and have been that trauma in your life. There's also the dwelling place called Mara. And it's up to you which one you'll pick. Father, this morning our prayer is that whatever it is that we've been through, whatever it is that we've gone through, whatever it is that those things still just feels like they might be haunting us. Loss, relationships that have been broken, the way people have treated us. Father, some of those things, Lord, you've allowed them to happen as tests to how will we respond? What will we do? Will we say, well, just stay here at Mara? Don't call me by my name. Call me my new name, bitterness. Because that's my identity. That's all I know. We say that we believe in God, but then when it comes to serving you and trusting you, we struggle. We struggle in those times of trauma, the struggle that, Father, the things of life that we go through that we wish we never would have. And we make our dwelling place, our encampment, Mara. Instead of Elam, where you have the springs and the palm trees and good things for us, we can stay encamped at Mara. But Lord, what I know about you is that you're a God who has the ability to break those things in our lives. And so, Lord, I pray that with your Spirit moving here this morning in our hearts and in our lives, Lord, that you would begin to break some of those bonds of trauma, of the things that we've experienced that we never wanted to. Well, we've cried out to you and say, God, I don't want this. I never wanted it. I don't know why you're doing this to me. But Lord, what I know is that you love us. You loved us enough to send your Son. You've loved us enough to make a way to get to you. And I know that we have a Savior, a great high priest, who's sitting at your right hand, interceding for us. And Lord, I pray that we would lean more into that, more into Jesus as our Savior and Jesus as our intercessor, Jesus the one who stands in the gap for us, than we would leaning into the bitterness and the hurt and the despair, that we would lean into the freedom instead of the bondage. Folks, this morning, if there's anything that you need prayer for, if there's anything you need to hand over to God this morning, bitterness, anger, frustration, if you've been holding on to those things, if those are the things that have been your name, it's time to let go of them. If I can pray with you here at the altar and help you with that, don't miss the chance. Don't miss the opportunity that God has given you this morning over these next few moments.